This is Dave, aka the Guru, and another tutorial using Gamesalad. In this small video series, I'm going to show you how to build an inventory system for your RPG type game, similar to the one I built here. So let's go ahead and just take a look at this little system that I've built. And what I've got up here is this is going to be what our item is equipped from our inventory. And then we've got some items here that we can collect as we go. And we also have our little inventory. So if we come here right now, we'll see we're at our inventory screen and we don't have anything in our inventory. So let's go ahead back and let's pick up something. And then we come back and we see that we've got our inventory item picked up, and we can click it and it'll put it in our active inventory. And so let's just go ahead and select. I'm going to go ahead and select a couple other items here. And then we'll go to our inventory and we see it's put all the items we've collected in our inventory, and we can switch between the items that we've got equipped here, and it automatically updates. So let's go ahead and let me show you something cool. Let's go ahead and fill out our inventory. So let's just look back. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 spaces. So let's go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So now if we come into our inventory, we can see now that our inventory is full. So what if we have some more items that we want to collect, but we want to make this so that the player has to drop an item to put in a new one? So if we come back in here, I've got this set up so that if I click another item, it's going to take me right to the inventory, and I might move this down a little bit. And you're going to see that it said inventory full, select the item you want to replace. So let's go ahead and click on an item, and we can see it's now replaced an item with the new item. And we can go back and let's go ahead and equip it now. And we can equip it, and we can see that it shows up in our little inventory. So let's go ahead and look at how, I don't know how many this will go. I don't want to go too long in each video. It might take 2, might take 3. So let me go ahead and show you how to build this inventory system. So now let's get into building our system. So that's the first thing we're going to want to do is create a table. So let's go to the home screen and up to the tables, and we'll make a table, and we'll call this inventory. And I like to do a .tbl in capitals, and that helps me locate my tables in my list of variables. So now let's go ahead to our scene. Oh, actually, I'm sorry. Excuse me. Let's go back to our table. Let's change this to an integer. That way that we can identify. We're going to do a couple things, which is why we're going to use an integer over text. So let's make 12 rows because we're going to make 12 slots. And you can expand this out. It's all the same principles. And let's go ahead and call this item. And so we've got our 12 slots and our item that we're going to fill in here. So let's go back. So now that we've got that set up, let's take a look real quick at the images that I've got in here. So now you can see that I've got my images in here, and I've named each one in a series. So I've given each one a number of what product or what item it is. So I've also got this little question mark that I did 0, and you'll see why we did that. So I used an I, the letter I, and I gave it a number. So that says inventory item or item 0, item 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And so we've identified each one with a number, and this is going to help us build some really slim code, really intuitive code this way, because not only does the 7 give us an identification of the image, but it also gives us an identification that we can use on what the item is itself. So we can use that one variable in the table system, as you'll see, to not only call the image, but to identify which item it is and its associated power information. So now let's do a couple of housekeeping here of some variables that we're going to make. So let's make a couple variables. We're going to make 4 integer variables. So let's go ahead and we'll just make them all real quick. Okay, and the first one we're going to call item active. And the next one we're going to call item picked up. And the third one we're going to call slot available. And the fourth one we're going to call inventory full. Now, I like to use integers over booleans, as you're going to see, because a boolean is limiting. It can only be related to one thing, and it's either true or false. And as you're going to see how I use integers, you're going to basically see how you can begin to kind of manipulate integers up in a progression that helps you trigger other code in your game. I never use booleans. I always like to go with integers because it just allows me the ability to expand certain conditions based on escalating numbers, and it gives me room for my code to grow if I come across something as I'm building it and say, ooh, I really need another condition in there. I'd like to be able to go off that variable, and so you can just progress the number up. And it shows, and it changes a certain state of the variable where you're at in your process, in your code, and you'll see this as we go along. So one of the first things that we're going to go ahead and build out is, let's go ahead and let's build out our slots that we're going to do. So let's go ahead and let's make an actor, and we'll call this our inventory slots. So we're going to use this actor. It's going to be a custom duplicate actor off a prototype. And so we need a couple of integer self-integers. So let's go ahead and make those two. And the first one we're going to call row number. And this is going to link to the row that is going to house the information for this particular slot. And we're going to identify the slot with a self integer. So we're going to call this item, item number. This is going to be the number of the item that's being held in the slot, whether there's an item in there at 0 or whatever. So there's a row. This is going to tell us what row in the table we're looking at. We know it's just column 1. So we don't need that. And then the item number, this we're going to fill in with the information that's inside the table in the integer, which we're going to use a numbering system. So 1 through however many items we have. And since we've numbered our images, okay, like this, we can use all this same data and we can build this really cool, generic, real simple code. So let's go ahead and grab a constraint attribute. And so one of the first things that we're going to want to constrain is we're going to constrain the self item number to its table cell value. So we're going to go ahead and grab a table cell value, and we're going to go to grab our inventory table right here. And then the row number is going to be the self row number. Okay, and then the column we know is 1. So what this is going to do is, if there's an item in that particular row number, so we're going to number these 1 through 12. We're going to make 12 copies and number this 1 through 12. So we're going to, each one's going to be, one will be row 1, 2, 3, 4, be looking for that particular information that's in our table in that row in column 1. So by defining a row number, and we're going to define this number manually after we make the copies. And so this is going to look in the table and say, what is in there? What's in that row? Is it a 0? What item number is it? So once we define the item number, and so we're going to take this information that's in the table, what item's in there, and we're going to fill in this variable. So now what we can do is we're going to go ahead and grab the image. So the image will always be, so we're going to go ahead and we're going to say self image, and since we've imaged our images by the numbers, we can use that information in the table with a little function to get it. So since I put an I in the beginning, what I need to do first is all text must be in quotes. So we're going to define the first part of our image name in these quotes. So now we're getting the I. Everyone has an I, so we know that, but the second part of the image name is different. It's a number. So we separate variables from each other or text with 2 periods. So we're going to put 2 periods. And now what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and grab the item number. And then we're going to get 2 periods. And then we're going to put in quotes .png. And we're going to close it off. So now what this is going to do is it's going to go and say constrain your self image to the image with the name I, whatever number is in our table in that row, okay, and whatever item 7, and then we know these are PNGs, .png, so we're going to say whatever this is, so if this item number was 7, it's going to go and grab image I7.png, and it's going to always make sure that the image matches whatever information is in that row of our table. So now that's all we have to do, and that'll work for every image and any number that's placed in that table. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and let's just make up how we're going to select the item. So let's grab a rule, and we'll call this will be use item. So this will be when we want to click on an item in the inventory and then put it into our slot that we're using the item. So we're going to say when actor receives event, touch is pressed, and let's make we're going to make 2 more conditions. And so we're going to say when attribute game dot inventory full, because as you see later on, we have that ability. Remember I showed you that when we need to press to change out an item, okay, this number is going to be different from 0 when we do that. So when the inventory's full, this number inventory full is going to change to a 1 value. And so we don't want to be using an item, trying to use an item when we're trying to replace an item in our setup. So this is going to block us out from doing that, because this will change to 1 when we select an item in the game, and when we go to our table we have to do our replacing. Okay, so this is going to lock that out. This is a lockout to keep us from, when we go in and when we're pressing to change an item or drop an item, it's going to keep us from going ahead and selecting that into we want to use it. Okay, so it's a lockout in our logic. And so the next thing we want to do is we want to say, and when attribute self item number doesn't equal 0, right? Because if there's nothing in there, we don't want to switch to an item that's nothing. So that's not going to let you select that item if there's no item in that slot. So that's another lockout. And so what we're going to do now is, if all those conditions are good, then we're going to go ahead and say change game dot item active. So that's going to be the item we've selected, that we're using that item right now, that we've activated it. And we're going to change that to the self item number, which is going to tell us what item is in use right now. So now let's do our code for when we touch this spot in our inventory to replace the actor. So let's do a code that says replace item. Okay. And so what we want to do is we want to say attribute, and we want to say, we want to say when actor receives event, touch is pressed. And we're going to have one condition in here. And so what's going to happen in our inventory code is when we click on an item and the inventory is full, it's going to change inventory full to 1, this inventory full variable. And that inventory full variable is going to pause the game, because we're going to use the pause scene when we go to the inventory. It's going to pause the game, bring the player to their inventory and say, hey, you can't pick that item up because you don't have a place to put it. So when that happens in our code in the inventory menu then automatically, once it goes to that menu, tells the player that they can't pick up that item with that little text at the bottom. When it switches to press an item to remove it and put that item in there, it changes the inventory progressive number to 2. So it changes this inventory full number to 2 and says, okay, now we're in the condition where you can press the item to replace it. So what we're going to do is we're going to say when our attribute game.inventory full equals 2, now we can go ahead and replace the item. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a couple of change attributes. So we're going to say, now that we've clicked the item, we're going to say game, the slot available is going to become this slot. So now we're going to go ahead and say the available slot that we can put and you'll see where this slot available comes into play when we build out our manager for organizing all the, putting all the objects in order in the table. So we're going to say slot available. We're going to change that now to tell that variable, this is where we're going to put that information. We're going to change slot variable to itself row number. Okay, so we're going to be telling us what slot is available in our group of 12. So that's essentially slots or row numbers or places in the table. So we're going to now define that information, and then we're going to go ahead and step this variable one more time. So now that we've made the change to what slot is available, okay, because you'll see our search code, we're going to search the table to tell us which slot is available, and then it's going to put that information to game slot. If it searches all the slots and finds that none are available, that slot available will stay at 0, and that's what triggers our other stuff. And so we're going to now fill that place in with the one we want to replace, and then we're going to go ahead and step this variable one more time to let the system know, to let our code know, okay, we're going to step it to 3, which means, okay, now we've gone ahead and we've put a value in the slot available. Now when we trigger to 3, you'll see we're going to go ahead and fire the code that's going to go ahead and do the replacing at that point. So that's all we need to do to build out our 12 slots. So let's go ahead, and I got a little background image here that I'm using, and let's just go ahead and drag that image in here just to give us a little background here, and we'll go ahead and just scale it up just to make it fit. So this is going to be our little background here for our inventory, and let's go ahead here and let's go to our scenes, and let's name this inventory, so that we know. Oh. Well, this is going to be our inventory scene, and we have that. So now we can go ahead and let's go ahead and make 12 copies of this prototype. And I'm not going to get all fancy on you here because it's a tutorial. So we'll just go ahead and copy a bunch of these, and I'll just do my best to place them somewhat neatly. Okay, and so what you're going to do is, however you want to order these, we're going to go ahead and we're going to click on the row number, and we're going to put the row number in there. So I'm going to go this way, left to right, left to right, left to right. So I'm going to go ahead and just number all these up, left to right. So I'm going to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So I'm going to pause the video. I'm going to do that, and then I'll come back. So I've gone ahead and identified all these slots by their numbers, 1 through 12. Now let me show you something cool that's going to happen. You see, all these are white right now. But since, right, all our information in the inventory in the table right now are all zeros, right? Well, this is why I made this little question mark, and you can make this whatever you want, an empty slot. I just made it this way. Notice how I named it 0. So when it goes to look at the code, right, when it goes up here, it puts the item number in it, it's 0, and it goes to the image, the self number is going to be 0, right? So automatically, it's going to just put in all those question marks. It's going to do an empty slot number. We don't have to do any changing images and all that kind of stuff, which would be a bunch of redundant embedded rules. It's just going to automatically put everything because it's 0 as an empty slot. There's nothing in there. So if we went into our table, let's just go into our table and do it this way. Let's just add some, I've got like up to 30 images. So let's just go ahead and put some numbers in here just to demonstrate. Okay, and let's go ahead to our table, and now you see it's put all the images related to those numbers that I have down in here automatically into their position. Okay, it's changing the image automatically. So now let's go ahead into our table, and we'll zero all this out so we know all that's working. Okay, and we've got that all set. So now let's go ahead and make our manager. Let's make our scene manager that's going to keep track of our inventory, what we're picking up, and all of that. So let's go ahead and build the code that we're going to use to identify an empty slot. So we'll call this inventory manager. Okay, and let's just, I like to make my scene managers some kind of color so I can identify them. It's just something I like to do. And so we're going to need a self variable, because we're going to use a loop over table, and we need an index integer. So now let's go ahead and we're going to check for an empty slot. Now, since we're using a loop, we don't want this thing firing all the time. So the first thing we want to do is we want to make a rule, and we'll call it check for empty slot. So we only want this checking for an empty slot when we're looking for one. So we're going to go and we're going to grab that attribute that we made that we call slot available. So we want to have the slot available always be when it's 0. When we're looking at 0 slots available, we want to go ahead and do the loop. Because we're going to clear this out, because we only need to look for a slot available each time we pick up an item. So when the slot available is 0, it's going to go ahead and look for the empty slot. And so basically, when it looks for an empty slot, even once we've filled the slot and changed it to 0, it will run again and pick up the next empty slot right away. So it'll have that waiting for us, that information. So let's go ahead, and we're going to go ahead and grab a loop over table behavior, and we're going to select our table here, our inventory table, and we want to look in the rows, and we're going to start at the first cell and automatically go to the last cell because we only have 12. And so we're going to index where we're looking. So that what the index does, if you've never used a loop over table, what happens is as this is looping, self-index changes to each row number that it's currently looking at in the loop. So a loop happens once every code cycle, so it'll go row 1, then the next one will be row 2, and it just keeps looping through the whole table, looking at each particular row, and this identifies which row it's currently at, which piece of information in the loop we're looking at, whether it's row 1 through 12 in our situation. So we're going to use that to our advantage. So we're going to go ahead and fire some code each loop. So in this one right here, we're going to grab a rule and we're going to say log empty slot. So what we want to do is we want to go ahead and log where the empty slot is. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to do a numeric expression for this. And we're going to say, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the table. So we're going to watch the table. Each loop that goes by, the loop over table is going to change this self-index number. So the first time it's going to be 1. And then we're going to come through our rule. And so in our rule, what we want to do is we want to grab our inventory table, and then the row is going to be the self-index number. Okay, because this self-index number is going to change every cycle, and so this number will go 1 through 12. So we're going to watch each value in the table, so we know it's column 1. We're going to watch each row and each value. So when we find a row that equals 0, we're going to come by and we're going to say, okay, now change attribute game slot available to self-index. Okay, so let's go through this one more time. So what happens is when slot available equals 0, loop over the table. So every cycle, this is how the code's going to flow. It's going to come up and look and see if this is 0, and it's going to come down and it's going to say I'm searching the rows starting at the first cell, and then it's going to change this to 1. This happens really fast. This happens in 0.03 of a second is a code cycle. Okay, every 3/100ths of a second, this is going to happen. So then it comes down through here, and now this is going to look at the index value because everything happens in order. So this is going to change self-index to 1. This piece of code is going to look at the table, and it's going to be so self-index, whatever it is. So at the first scan, it's going to be 1. It's going to look to see if that's 0. If it's 0, it's going to change this to 1 because that's what it is. If not, it'll go by again, and then the second scan, it'll come by and say, well, this is still 0 because we haven't found a row that's empty. It'll come down and change the self-index to 2. This will look to see if the self-index, if row 2 has a 0 in it. If it doesn't, if it has a number in it, it'll go by again. If it has a 0, it'll say yes. It'll fire the rule right away and change this to 2 because that'll be the self-index. And that'll tell us which slot in the table. And this will just keep scanning until it finds the first empty place in the table every time. Okay? And that's basically how it does it. It's straight logic. You have to think it linearly in your head, not in the GUI here. So you have to see this step happens, and this step happens, and this step happens, and then this step either happens or it doesn't happen, depending on this condition. Okay? So now we're going to go ahead and we're going to add some code. We're going to add another rule in here for if our inventory is full. So let's go ahead inside this loop here, and let's go ahead and say inventory is full. Okay, so how we're going to do that is that if this scans through the whole table, right, we've got 12 rows. So if the self-index ends on 12, and that number and this is still 0, right? Because we're going to change this. If something's available, the self slot number, the game slot available will be a number. So if we scan through all 12 rows, so the first thing we want to do is because the self-index will run all the way to 12 and stop. It won't start again. It's just going to go to the first cell and the last cell. Okay. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to say if SelfIndex equals 12, that's the last row, and it equals 12, and it hasn't changed the index number. So if game slot available equals 0, so if it, right, because it'll stay 0. If it never finds a 0 slot, it won't change to a number. It'll stay, SelfIndex will stay at 0. So if that is still 0 after we scan all 12 rows, we're going to go ahead and trigger that variable we have. So we're going to change attribute. We're going to go ahead and come down to our inventory full, and we're going to change it to 1. And this is going to trigger the system in the code that we built in the other thing. Now it's going to start that process of being able to replace, okay, because now that we've designated that the inventory is full. If the inventory is not full, it'll skip right by this rule, do this one, and this will never fire. Okay, so now what we've got, that's our scanning system. That's going to scan through and look and see that and tell us which piece of row is valid. If everything's full, it's going to do this. It's going to trigger this stuff. Okay, and so now let's go ahead down. Let's close this up, and let's make a rule here. And this rule is going to be the code that allows us to put an item in an empty slot. So once you've clicked the item on the scene, you don't have to go to the inventory. It'll automatically put it in the table. So when we have an empty slot and we want to put something in it, this is going to be our code for that. So we're going to be put item in empty slot. Okay, and so we're going to use a couple of we're going to use 3 conditions in here. Okay, so we're going to say when attribute game slot available doesn't equal 0, and then attribute game item picked up, right? Because we're gonna, you'll see when we pick up an item, we're gonna put that number into this item picked up. Okay, so we've got to be in the process of picking up an item if we want to store it. So that doesn't equal 0, so there's nothing in there. There's no item in there. We haven't picked up an item, so we got to make sure that we have a slot available, that we have picked up an item, and then the last one's going to be, we want to make sure that we're not in a full inventory condition. This is only for putting stuff in an available empty slot. So we're going to say game inventory full equals 0. Okay, so we've got 3 conditions or 3 lockouts that's got to be proper in our logic in order for us to write to an empty slot. So we have to have a slot available, we have to have an item picked up, and the inventory can't be full. So once we do that, then we're going to come down and we're going to grab a change table value, and we're going to go ahead and grab our table. And then the row, we want it to be game slot available, right? Because that's what that is. That's the row number. Okay. And the column we know is 1. And then the item, the value is going to be the game item picked up, because that's going to be the number of the item that we picked up in there. And then we need to come down and grab a timer. I'm going to grab a timer, and I'm going to say after 0.3. I like to put a delay in my table saving to make sure this gets written out well, because you just never know. Things can lag. So this is a couple code cycles here. And we'll go ahead and save our table, and we'll go ahead and save it to our inventory table. So now let's go ahead and do one last thing, and we're going to build out our code and let's copy this because we're going to use similar situation. So we're going to say, for this, replace item in slot. So we're gonna, let's just back this up, and we'll get rid of that, and we'll change this to, we get before the T, replace. So actually, we'll switch these two. Close this up. That's our put item. So replace item in slot. And so now what we're going to do is we're going to have a lot of the same conditions, but now this game inventory full, that's going to be, we want that to be at the number 3. And as you'll see when we go in and build out our other stuff, the code for that, you'll see how I progress that game inventory full to 3. So, and that happens when we touch an object. So when we go in and we have up here, we check for empty slot, right? If the game inventory is full, it's going to switch to 1. When that switches to 1, you'll see it's going to trigger our pause menu. We're going to go into our scene. The first bit of text is going to come up, and it's going to say, hey, your inventory is full. That stays on screen for a second. Then we switch the text where and it says select an item to replace or drop and put your other item in there. When that happens, in that you'll see when we do it that we change it to 2. And then when it's 2 and we go ahead and push on an item now, it's going to change that number to 3. And when it's 3, then we're going to go ahead and write that information in to our table, because now we've filled in the game slot available. Remember when we were looking at that? That's why we had that do that way. So what we're going to do is we're going to save the inventory table, and then what we want to do is, now that we know that that information's been written in, we're going to save the table first, and then we're going to go ahead and say we're going to change game inventory full back to 0. Okay, so that's going to zero all that out, because we need to zero that out so that we can go back into our menu and click on stuff to equip ourselves with it. Remember, this locks us out from equipping an item because we're replacing. So we need to make sure after we've recorded this all in and save the table, then we're going to go ahead and say, okay, we're done with the replacing, and now we're going to go back to 0, which is going to allow our inventory to function normally in this logic. So this will cut out this rule at this point, because this will no longer be 3, it'll be 0, and we won't do any more overwriting in this situation. And so that's the first part. That's all for our inventory manager. And so that's the first part of building out our inventory system. And in the next video, we will go ahead and start doing our items and showing you the code in the items itself for picking them up. So this is Dave, the Guru. You can find me on the forums under the name Lost Oasis Games. I'll see you in the next video.